Imagine you're driving a delivery truck down the highway on a sunny Sunday afternoon. The radio's on, nothing unusual, and then the landing gear of a Boeing 767 sends a light pole through your windshield. Because that is exactly what happened back in May when a United Airlines 767 came in so low on its approach into Newark that it clipped a light pole on the New Jersey Turnpike and then just carried on and landed. Cue the calls for disciplinary action for the pilots and the comments about the state of aviation today. But was it actually that simple? Because as always, there is way more to this story than just simple pilot error. Now, I want to be clear here. I'm not suggesting that what happened wasn't a big deal or even that this crew didn't make a mistake. But what I am saying is that there is at least one factor that played a big role in this story that hasn't been widely spoken about. Which is a shame because this has happened before and really recently too. Now the FAA and other regulators may need to do a better job of highlighting this issue before it causes other very low approaches either in Newark or elsewhere. And this problem involves the PAPI lights, which may seem straightforward, but sometimes it isn't. So, if you somehow missed this, it happened on Sunday the 3rd of May at around 1:50 p.m. local time, involving United Airlines Flight 169. The aircraft is a Boeing 767-400ER with registration November 77066, and it's worth remembering that the 400 is the longest variant of the 767. Now, obviously, this event is still under investigation, and as we record this, the NTSB's preliminary report was just released, and it shows that this flight was on the RNAV Whiskey approach into Newark's runway 29. Now, apart from a couple of hundred hours of Cessna 152s flying around Florida and Nevada, I haven't flown much in the United States myself, but I'm told that this approach and the Stadium Vision approach, which follows a very similar track, are among the country's most spectacular approaches, with the aircraft descending around the New York skyline on a southerly heading with Manhattan on its left, and then making a right turn to line up with the runway. Then the aircraft crosses the New Jersey Turnpike, also known as the I-95, before going over the fence and touching down on runway 29. However, just before that final turn at waypoint Axel, this RNAV becomes a visual approach, and these approaches are less precise than the other instrument approaches, and counterintuitively, they can demand a little bit more attention. And in the case of the Stadium visual, that right turn onto final is actually made quite late, when the aircraft is around 700 feet above the ground, and on this particular flight, it appears that the crew might have been a tad too high to start with. And then the ADS-B data shows the aircraft getting into a relatively high rate of descent, above 1,200 feet per minute for a few seconds, just as they were lining up with the runway. And then they flew right over the turnpike, just as a guy working for a bakery company drove past in a truck. Now the truck's dashcam footage shows the driver being surprised by the noise and then spending a couple of seconds trying to see the aircraft that he knew must be really close. And then it happened. The NTSB reports that the main landing gear of the United 767 hit a light pole, which then hit the windshield of the truck, and which in turn hit the side of the truck's trailer. Security video footage shows the trailer momentarily rolling sideways as the light pole gives it a nudge, but thankfully the trailer then rights itself. Another couple of inches lower, and all of this could have looked very different. There are also reports that the light pole then hit another car whose occupants thankfully didn't suffer any injuries. Unfortunately though, the truck driver did have to be taken to hospital with some non-life-threatening injuries, mainly shards of glass from the windscreen which was hit by that light pole. Meanwhile though, the pilots continued the approach and landed their aircraft safely, but they did report that they felt something just as they crossed the runway threshold, and ground personnel later found a hole on the side of the airplane. Thankfully, nobody else was injured, but as for the aircraft, well, at the time of recording this in the beginning of June, the aircraft hasn't flown again a month after the event. So all of this begs the question, how could this have happened? Well, on top of the somewhat challenging visual approach, this was a gusty day. The winds were coming from 320 degrees at 12 knots, gusting 24, no doubt adding to the crew's workload. And then we come to the runway itself, which isn't exactly long. Newark Liberty International has 3 runways. two that see the most use are 4 left and 2 right at 3,353 meters or 11,000 feet long. And its parallel pair, runway 4 right and 2 left, which is a little bit shorter at 3,048 meters or 10,000 feet, but both of those runways are decently long. But then there's runway 1129 that this 767 was landing on, which is only 2,050 meters or 6,725 feet, a bit tight for a 767, but we do know that even Boeing 777s do land on that runway. Now, it's not uncommon for pilots to subconsciously aim for an earlier touchdown on a runway that they know is a little bit short. And sure enough, it looks like the captain, who was pilot flying that day, was thinking along these lines and had a strategy for not landing long. And I'm going to get back to that in a moment. But I want to be clear here, because even with the wind conditions at play on the day and the tricky visual approach, this aircraft should not have been anywhere near as low as it was. All runways are designed with a very specific defined obstacle clearance rules, so the aircraft should get no lower than 50 feet from the ground or any obstacles as it crosses the beginning of the runway, known as the threshold. So on runways with a normal 3-degree approach angle or glide slope, the touchdown zone will be around 300 meters or 1,000 feet from the beginning of the runway threshold. Now, if that distance isn't enough to guarantee the right clearance over buildings, trees, bridges, or elevated roads, or other terrain on short final, then that runway threshold will be displaced, meaning that the markings for the threshold and the touchdown zone are all moved further into the paved runway and away from the airport perimeter. If the runway does have a displaced threshold, the first part of the runway is marked differently and it can still be used for takeoff, but everything in the runway and the approach aids that we use is now set to ensure that we land further down the runway. And in the case of runway 29 in Newark, that threshold is displaced by around 224 feet or 68 meters to account for the I-95 and its traffic. So all in all, if everything is designed right, there should be no reason for an aircraft to get so close to the ground. And even if the aircraft gets a bit low on approach, there should be plenty of margin to keep things safe. Or have we missed something here? Well, shortly after this event happened, Petter released a short video on the Mentor Pilot channel where he quickly went through what we knew at the time. But since then, a couple of viewers and other friends of the channel contacted us to bring something to our attention: the PAPI lights. Now, I'm sure many of you know what these are and what they do, but what you might not know is that PAPIs are definitely not universal. And I'll explain what I mean by that after this. You've probably heard by now that Europe is in for a bit of a treat on the 12th of August. A solar eclipse will sweep across the continent for the first time since 1999, likely bringing several major cities to a standstill. Parts of Portugal, Spain, France, northern Italy, Germany, the UK, Iceland, and even parts of New England and Alaska in the US will experience 85 to 100% totality, meaning that for a few fleeting moments, the moon will fully block the sun, revealing a night sky full of stars in the middle of the day. But looking directly at an eclipse is dangerous. You can very easily get UV burns to your retina, which are not only really painful, but in the worst cases can actually leave you blind. And that's exactly what I'll be watching with one of these, the Solar Eclipse Viewing Kit from today's sponsor, VisiSolar. Their glasses are approved by the American Astronomical Society, so you know they're the real deal. And the last thing you want is to end up with a sketchy fake that doesn't give you the full protection and you end up permanently damaging your eyes. The kit also comes with a precision photo filter for your phone camera, so you can actually capture the moment without wrecking your lens as well. And VisiSolar are offering a 10% discount. So scan this QR code or head to visisolar.com/discount/mentor now to grab your kit at this exclusive price. Thanks again to VisiSolar. Now, let's get back to the video. Okay, so let's take a closer look at PAPI lights. PAPI is short for Precision Approach Path Indicator, and their purpose is to help pilots follow a specific approach angle or glide slope all the way down to the runway. PAPIs are typically arranged as a series of 4 lights in line next to the touchdown zone of the runway. And the light that each of the 4 PAPI lights produce is one of 2 colours, either red or white. And the colour that the pilots see changes depending on whether the aircraft is above, below or perfectly on the correct approach path, which is typically 3 degrees. And this is achieved by a clever use of angled filters, Now, the idea is that if an aircraft is coming in to land at the correct angle, then the pilots will see 2 white lights and 2 red lights. And if we were just a bit high on approach, we'll see 3 whites and a red. And if we're much too high, we'll see 4 white lights. And the same principle applies if we're too low. 1 white and 3 reds if a little bit low, and all reds if too low. Basically, red equals danger. So if you see more reds, you're too low. The advantage of having 2 white and 2 red lights instead of just 1 of each is because with just 2, you don't know how far off the correct approach you are. You're either too high or too low. Whereas with 4, we have the slightly high and slightly low, which can work towards fixing. For example, when they're set for the typical 3-degree glide, the highest light is set to switch colours at 3.5 degrees. The next one below that, 3.17 degrees. Then when we're below, 2.83 degrees, and the lowest one for 4 reds is at 2.5 degrees. Now, mechanically, PAPIs aren't very sophisticated. Both white and red lights on each of the 4 units sit in the same assembly, typically using the same light source with filters and lenses, which is done that way to minimise as much as possible the angle where we can see both white and red on the same light. When we can just see a bit of both, we call that a pink. So if a pilot saw 3 reds and a pink, they would be approaching a 2.5 degree glide and need to start correcting immediately. Any lower than that, especially close to the ground, would be the time to go around and have another go. But a really important point I want to highlight here is that PAPI design is based around eye to wheel height. This is the vertical distance from the pilot's eyes to the lowest portion of an aircraft in the landing attitude as it passes over the threshold. And it's precisely here where the problem with PAPIs begin to show themselves. Since this setup is so simple and completely fixed, and since it's just visual based on what the pilots can see, how does all of this work with aircraft of different sizes? Well, it all comes down to the pilot's eye height as they cross the threshold, and the distance between the pilot's eyes and the position of their landing gear would vary significantly between different aircraft. So let's use a pretty extreme comparison to highlight this. Imagine a set of PAPI lights calibrated for light aircraft such as Cessna 172s. These PAPIs will be set up so that they guide the pilot to cross the threshold of the runway at the correct height of 50 feet and touch down right in the middle of the touchdown zone. But now let's look at what would happen if a Boeing 747 flew the same approach using those same PAPI lights. The pilot would still see 2 red and 2 white lights. It's all looking good. But because the pilot sits so much higher above the landing gear in the 747, look at how much closer the landing gear is to the ground compared to the 172, which is where it should be. And this really highlights the dangers of following PAPI guidance which aren't calibrated for your aircraft. But what I really want to emphasize here is that this isn't just a problem when comparing 747s with Cessnas. It can still be a significant problem even when comparing airliners, say like a single aisle 737 or A320 on the one hand, and a Boeing 767 say on the other. And for this comparison, I'm going to use a Boeing 767-400, like the aircraft in this incident, and compare that to an Airbus A320. If a runway has its PAPIs calibrated for aircraft such as the A320, they'll correctly guide the pilots down to the runway so that the aircraft passes the threshold at the correct height of 50 feet, which ensures safe obstacle clearance. But now, if a Boeing 767 were to fly that same approach, the eye to wheel height is significantly more, meaning that if the pilot's eyes cross the threshold at the same point, seeing 2 reds and 2 whites, the main gear of the 767 will now be significantly closer to the ground than that A320, and likely won't meet the required obstacle clearance criteria. And this shows that even between different airliners, we need different categories of PAPI setups. Now, it's important to bear in mind here that it's not really possible to adjust the PAPIs to behave differently for different aircraft, since the only way to adjust the lights for different aircraft is to physically move the lights themselves. So we've got different PAPI setups for different aircraft, but unfortunately, they're not fully standardized around the world. But they are all based around eye to wheel height. And as we said, this is the vertical distance from the pilot's eyes to the lowest portion of an aircraft in the landing attitude as it passes over the threshold. Now, in the United States, the FAA defines 4 categories called height groups, numbered from 1 through to 4. And as far as we can tell, the PAPI lights for runway 29 at Newark are not set for an aircraft the size of a 767. The 76 is a height group 4 or HG4 aircraft, But it appears that the pappies for Newark's runway 29 were set up either for height group 2 or height group 3 aircraft, meaning the smaller single-aisle jets like the Boeing 737 and the Airbus A320. Now, this isn't necessarily a problem in its own right. If the pilots flew the approach knowing that the pappies aren't calibrated for their aircraft type, well, they can just adjust accordingly. But the problem is that the information about what kind of pappy lights the pilots will find on the runway is not always spelled out in black and white on their approach charts or airport diagrams. Well, at least not in the United States. Instead, the FAA instructs airports to set up their pappy lights according to the most demanding aircraft, which I think generally means the biggest, which make regular use of the runway. And what regular means may be debatable or even change over time. Now, this wouldn't really be that difficult of a fix. We know that because other countries like Canada are already doing it. If we compare the airport diagram of Newark with the chart of an airport in Canada that a viewer sent us, we can see one important difference. In Newark, there is a P symbol in a circle near the beginning of every runway to tell us roughly where and on which side of the runway the pappies are. In the Canadian chart, however, we see basically the same P in a circle near the end of each runway, but with a number next to it, in this case P2. And that tells us that this set of pappies is intended for aircraft with an eye to wheel height of 25 feet, which makes it appropriate for A320s or Boeing 737s, but not wide bodies. Now, like I said earlier, these size systems aren't standardized around the world, neither are the size categories or the charts, which makes things even harder. So finally, let's go back to the United 767-400 in Newark and see how all of this comes together to affect the story. Firstly, in a security camera video at the airport, we can see that at the point where the aircraft wheels hit the light pole and just miss the roof of the truck, the 767 has quite a nose-high attitude. And this was possibly because the pilots realised that they were a little bit too low and were correcting. And this is corroborated by the NTSB preliminary report, which said that at this point the 767 had gotten too low. But higher pitch attitudes mean that their main landing gear was now even lower compared to the pilot's eyes in the cockpit. To see what that means visually, let's go back to our aircraft silhouettes and compare an A320 at a more or less neutral attitude on approach before the flare and a Boeing 767-400 in a 5-degree pitch up attitude, which is likely close to what we see here in the video. And this time, we'll align their main landing gear vertically. And even in this simplified example, the 767's gear is about 4 meters or just over 13 feet lower. And to these 13 feet, we need to add another 13.5 feet, which is probably the height of the truck's trailer. And suddenly we've eaten through over half of that 50-foot clearance over the fence. But we're not done just yet. In our comparison graphic, we assume that the 767 is sitting at a perfect 3-degree glide, with the pilots' heads looking at 2 white and 2 red pappy lights, which we now know was not the case. As I said earlier, this flight's captain had a strategy to avoid landing long, and that strategy, as he told the NTSB investigators, was to align his aircraft so that he would see 1 white and 3 red lights on the pappies. But that's exactly why we have the kind of obstacle clearance rules to make sure that when weather or simple human error, or both, try to ruin our day, that everyone still gets to go home safely. Now, I should make it clear that the NTSB's latest report does not highlight the effect of pappies for different aircraft sizes in this accident. But we wanted to put this information out because we don't think that this aspect of pappy lights is highlighted enough in approach charts and airport diagrams, or even by aviation authorities. In the FAA's own definitions of height groups, the difference between height group 2, which we believe the pappies for this runway was set to, and height group 4 that the 767 belongs in, the visual threshold crossing height has a difference of 30 feet, which is a world of difference. And as I said at the start, incidents and accidents like these have happened before. On January the 12th, 2023, a Delta Airlines Airbus A330, which is a little bit bigger than a 767, was on approach into Amsterdam Schiphol Airport in the Netherlands for runway 22, which happens to be the shortest of the 6 available runways at the airport. Now, the puppies on that runway were set up for, yep, you guessed it, 737s and A320s. And the Delta crew, who weren't really happy with the length of the runway, later stated that they decided to adjust their glide a bit to make sure they didn't land long. The result? Well, Gusty weather and maybe a bit of fatigue after a long trip from Detroit meant that they got too low and actually touched down before the threshold on the grass. Luckily though, there were no roads near that runway, and other than getting mud on the fuselage and having to inspect their main landing gear, the aircraft was basically undamaged. Amsterdam though has since banned A330s from landing on this runway, even if it is technically long and strong enough to do the job. But they do have 5 other long runways, so it kind of makes sense. Highlighting this matter better and putting the puppy aircraft size category on approach charts or airport diagrams seems like an easy fix to help prevent these kinds of events from happening again. And I really hope that one of the positives that comes out of this incident is that the FAA and other aviation authorities around the world make this vital bit of information clearer and easy for pilots to find. But what do you think? Have you heard of something that needs a bit more attention? Let us know in the comments below. My name's Ben Watts. You're watching Mentor Now. Have an amazing week, and I'll see you next time.